Welcome in. Today we're diving deep into the vice presidential debate, Vance versus Walz. And
Yeah.
this wasn't just another stop on the campaign trail, you know.
Right.
With just 5 weeks to go before the election and early voting already underway this one night, had the potential to be a real game changer.
Absolutely.
Especially with so much happening in the
Right.
world. The Iranian missile attack on Israel, Hurricane Helene. It just felt like voters were really tuning in with, let's say, a heightened sense of gravity.
Yeah, like a wake-up call that the stakes were suddenly very, very real.
Exactly.
And to add to the pressure, this was their only debate.
Right.
No second chances to make a first impression. But both the BBC and the AP pointed out how, surprisingly civil it was.
Yeah.
Almost a complete 180 from the slugfest we saw in the presidential debates. Yeah, I think that's a really important observation because it speaks to how Vance and Walz approached their roles.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all seen Vance lean into that firebrand persona, right?
Right.
But here, he's all about measured tones and policy specifics, almost like he's trying to project an air of, statesmanship.
It's like he traded his campaign rally playlist for something a little more
Yeah,
elevator music.
right.
But was that strategic or did it feel genuine? Did he actually pull it off?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did it resonate with, the voters who might have seen him as too extreme before? It's a tough needle to thread, appealing to both the Trump base and those moderate voters without alienating either one.
Yeah, and it's while Vance was aiming for statesmen, the BBC article mentioned that Walz stumbled a bit out of the gate. They open with foreign policy, talk about timely, right? And he just didn't seem as sure-footed,
Yeah.
at all.
And it's interesting because this isn't the first time Walz has seemed less confident on foreign policy.
Okay.
It's not exactly his bread and butter,
Right.
But the question is, did it hurt him? Did that early hesitation make a lasting impression? Or did he recover well enough to win over those undecided voters?
Yeah, because it's not like Vance hit a home run every time either, right? Let's talk about where they went head-to-head on policy. Abortion, gun control, immigration.
Yeah.
These are the hot-button issues where you really see the country divided.
Absolutely. And these are the issues where voters are looking for authenticity, right? For a candidate who reflects their values.
Yeah.
On abortion, the AP highlighted the contrast walls with a strong pro-choice stance, emphasizing a woman's right to choose, while Vance stuck to the GOP's pro-family message. It's classic framing, right?
Yeah.
And it raises the question, who did it better?
Right.
Who connected with voters on an emotional level, not just a policy level?
Then there's gun control, which feels impossible to ignore with everything that's happened.
Yeah.
And what's interesting here is that Walz, who's historically been pro-gun rights, seemed to shy away from anything too concrete.
Yeah.
He focused on background checks, but some Democrats might have wanted him to go further,
Sure.
especially with Vance on the other side.
You can see both sides of that coin, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, taking a strong stance on gun control could alienate moderate voters, particularly in rural areas where gun ownership is higher. On the other hand, this was a chance for Walz to clearly differentiate himself from Vance, to say, this is where we stand and this is what we believe in, even if it ruffled some feathers.
Right. And then, of course, there's immigration, which always seems to be a political lightning rod.
Right.
Vance doubled down on that hardline stance we've come to expect,
Yeah.
even going so far as to blame Harris for the border situation.
Right.
Walz countered by pointing out Trump's unfulfilled wall promise.
Sure.
It felt like a highlight reel of talking points we've heard a million times before, didn't it?
It did. And it speaks to how difficult it is to have a nuanced conversation about immigration.
Yeah.
It's so often framed as an us versus them issue, and neither candidate really broke out of that mold. Did either of them offer any concrete solutions, or was it mostly political maneuvering? I think that's for the voters to decide.
And speaking of political maneuvering, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, or maybe the elephant not in the room is more accurate.
Right.
I'm talking about Trump's claims about the 2020 election.
Yeah.
The sources all zeroed in on Vance dodging the question of whether Trump actually lost.
That was a pivotal moment, and I think it reveals a lot about Vance's strategy.
Uh-huh.
By refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the 2020 election, he's tying himself directly to Trump's narrative.
Right.
It's a gamble. It might energize the base, but could it alienate those moderate voters who are looking for someone who's not stuck in 2020?
Right.
It's a delicate balance, to say the least.
It feels like he's walking a tightrope trying to appeal to two very different groups with very different priorities.
Right. And while he's trying to straddle that line, the CNN Instant Poll actually showed a statistical dead heat after the debate. 51% for Vance, 49% for Walz.
Which, on the surface, might seem anticlimactic after all that buildup.
Right.
But I think we need to dig a little deeper into what those numbers actually tell us.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What do those numbers tell us? And what about Walz's performance? How much did that early stumble hurt him? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to break it all down after this.
Well, those poll numbers are interesting because they suggest that despite that early stumble, Walz was able to recover enough to keep things close.
Right.
And remember, this poll captured immediate reaction, so it's less about who won on points and more about who left, like a stronger lasting impression.
It's like, did they leave the audience wanting more, or were they ready for a commercial break? Exactly. And in Walz's case, it seems he really found his footing once they moved away from foreign policy and into those domestic issues where he's traditionally been stronger.
Okay.
The BBC article even pointed out that he seemed like much more comfortable and confident discussing healthcare and education.
Which makes sense given his background as a governor, right? You'd expect him to be more in his element there.
Right.
But it does raise the question in a debate that covered such a wide range of topics, from international crises to kitchen table issues. How much does a single stumble really matter?
It's hard to say for sure,
Yeah.
but what we can look at is how the candidates' overall performances and their chosen moments of emphasis played into their broader strategies.
Right.
For Vance, sticking close to Trump's narrative on the 2020 election might have been a strategic move to solidify his standing with the base. But it could also be a turnoff for those moderate voters he needs to sway.
It's a risky move, no doubt.
It is,
Almost like he's playing with fire, hoping he doesn't get burned.
and it highlights that, the
Yeah.
constant tension in campaigns, right?
Yeah.
Between energizing your base
Yeah.
and broadening your appeal.
Right.
It's a balancing act that's notoriously difficult to pull off.
Yeah. Speaking of balancing acts, what about Walz's more cautious stance on gun control? Do you think that was him trying to walk that same tightrope, appealing to both sides of the aisle?
It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
Remember, he's got a history of supporting gun rights, which puts him in a tricky position, especially in a national race where those lines are so starkly drawn. By sticking to background checks, he avoids alienating more moderate voters, but he also risks looking less than passionate about an issue that clearly matters to a lot of Democratic voters.
So it's back to that question of authenticity, isn't it? Were there any moments where you felt like either candidate really broke through the noise and spoke from the heart?
You know, there's one moment that stands out to me.
Okay.
The AP article mentioned it briefly.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a fiery exchange or a clever soundbite. It was actually a moment of shared humanity.
Okay.
Walz was talking about his own son witnessing gun violence.
Right.
And even Vance, who we've seen be pretty combative, responded with genuine concern.
Wow.
It was a brief glimpse of empathy and shared experience in what's often a very adversarial process.
It's those unexpected moments that can really stick with you, isn't it? It reminds you that these are real people with real families and real experiences behind the podiums.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to that desire we all have, right?
Yeah.
For authenticity, for leaders who can connect with us on a human level, even amidst disagreements.
Right. Yeah. So with all that said, how much do you think this debate actually matters?
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things, did it move the needle?
Well, if we're looking at the immediate aftermath, the CNN poll suggests it was more of a draw than a decisive victory for either candidate.
Right.
But I think it's too early to say what the long-term impact might be.
Because debates aren't just about scoring points in the moment.
Right.
It's about how they shape perceptions, how they play into the narratives that people carry with them to the voting booth.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
Because we're talking about influencing not just how people vote,
Yeah.
but why they vote the way they do.
Right.
And that's a much more complex and nuanced process.
It's like those ripples in a pond, right? You toss a pebble in and the effects might not be immediately obvious, but they spread outward, changing the landscape in subtle ways.
That's a great way to put it. And those ripples, those subtle shifts in perception, those moments of connection and dissonance, those are the things that can ultimately sway an election, especially in a race as tight as this one, where every vote truly does count.
So it's not just about the big pronouncements or the fiery rhetoric. It's about the smaller moments that resonate with people on a more personal level, like Walz talking about his son or Vance's more measured tone.
Why?
Even those subtle cues can have an impact.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to pay attention, not just to what the candidates are saying, but how they're saying it.
Right.
What are they choosing to emphasize? What are they avoiding? What kind of narrative are they trying to build?
It's like being a detective looking for clues in their words, their body language, their tone of voice,
Exactly.
and then trying to piece it all together to understand the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key takeaway for our listener from this deep dive.
Yeah.
Don't just accept the headlines or the instant polls at face value.
Right.
Dig deeper, ask questions, and form your own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Vance versus Walz, right?
Right.
It's about something much bigger.
It is.
It's about the future we want to build, the kind of country we want to live in.
Well said. And that future depends on our willingness to be engaged, informed, and thoughtful citizens.
So as we head into these final weeks of the campaign, let's all pledge to do just that. To stay curious, to keep asking questions, and to make our voices heard. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's always a fascinating conversation.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time.